The reason the press worldwide was involved in this story from all over the world is because Jerry McCann made it his business to market his child. He called it the marketing of Madeleine McCann.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until...
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime.
The sole objective of Jerry and Kate McCann was to keep their daughter's face in the newspapers and on television.
The voice you heard at the beginning of this clip is from Judy Bachrat, the contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and it's an interview she gave to Channel 5 on the 18th of November 2014. You can listen to that, the whole thing in context. I'll put a link to that in the description. You hear her speaking just before the 29-minute mark. It's also important to bear in mind just how unprecedented a sort of media frenzy would be in a situation where there were actually secrecy laws surrounding an open investigation. How do you end up with the most reported missing person case in history when it's actually in the context of Portuguese secrecy laws where no one's really allowed to talk about it at all? Not the people at the center of the case and not the police. And so here's a reminder of that also from this interview, from a episode titled Madeleine McCann, A Global Obsession. It appeared on Channel 5 in 2014. This time it's Paul Luckman, the owner of the Portuguese News, a local publication. And locally is going to give you a little bit of insight into what is typical in this area, especially in terms of the media.
So there was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, things started to get, shall I say, rather creative. And the Portuguese police, when they eventually realised that they're going to have to say something, which, as I say, normally wouldn't do and they're not permitted to do, they were handling a situation that was really outside their experience.
In the days, weeks and months following the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the McCanns weren't supposed to speak to anyone about what had happened besides local law enforcement. And that was due to, as I said earlier, local secrecy laws in Portugal. The interesting thing is the letter of the law meant Kate and Jerry couldn't discuss the case, and yet the media shitstorm that exploded around the McCanns, as I said, was one of the most spectacular and colossal ever seen in true crime history. Again, was this by accident or by design? And one thing I want to draw your attention to is a series of blog posts that have been recorded on a site. I also put a link to that in the description, that in the midst of this whole thing, that you're not allowed to speak to anyone. Well, perhaps the law doesn't say anything about blogging. And so in the midst of you're not allowed to say anything, well, someone is blogging. And bear in mind, in 2007, blogging was relatively new. Social media was relatively new. And so Jerry McCann would blog pretty much every day. And he ended up writing, I think it was, how many? 2,596 blogs. Could that be one way to control the narrative? Could that be one way to get a head start on the police files? I mean, the police files only came out in the middle of 2008. So with these hundreds of blogs in the media, and the media headlines day after day after day, week after week, month after month for a whole year. So by the time the police files came out, obviously in Portuguese initially, so that would also take a while to filter through, which narrative had asserted itself, which narrative was in control. But besides the blogging, there's also another very interesting strategy that the McCanns used to get around the silencing law. You know, if they couldn't say something, how about a spokesman? How about somebody else saying something, or a family member? Or what about an anonymous source? And as I said, a daily blog. And so let's take a look just at this idea of spokespeople that the McCanns hired. was that unusual how many of them were hired. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'm the author of 5 books on the Madeleine McCann case, the Doubt series, and then also the Deep Into Darkness series. And especially the Deep Into Darkness series involved a far more practical approach. I also went to Praia da Luz. I made certain measurements, and I really got a feel for, kind of a boots on the ground feel for Praia da Luz and the whole fabric. So I do highly recommend those 2 books if you're enjoying my analysis. In terms of this whole media analysis, I will be dealing with ridiculous Brookness saga and also how the Australian media have been dealing with that as this prime suspect that's a dead ringer for whatever happened to Madeleine McCann. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, this comes straight out of Wikipedia, so there's no spin from my side. I'm not trying to exaggerate anything. It's pure vanilla. It's just the neutral news, right? And so, according in the section Media and PR, this is a quote from that Wikipedia section. A PJ officer acknowledged in 2010 that Portuguese police had been suspicious of the McCanns from the start of the media circus. In other words, they responded to this media circus not with enthusiasm, to put it mildly. Jerry told Vanity Fair in 2008, and you heard the person that he was interviewed at the beginning of this episode. Anyway, he said he decided to market Madeleine to keep her in the public eye. To that end, a string of public relations consultants arrived in Praia da Luz, deeply resented by the local police. And so if you say that the McCanns cooperated with the police, well, do you think the police liked this aspect? Do you think the police complained about this aspect? Do you think the police were sidetracked by this aspect? Do you think this used up resources and attention and effort and basically directed attention away from the search for Madeleine in terms of the work that the police had to do? And if the answer is yes, how did the McCanns feel about that? If the police said, this is not helping, how do you think the McCanns felt about that? The local police saw the media attention as counterproductive. Alex Woolfall of the British PR firm Bell Pottinger, representing Mark Warner, dealt with the media for the first 10 days. And then the British government sent in press officers. This was apparently unprecedented. So you're not just getting press officers coming in, you're getting some of the biggest figureheads from the biggest firms, PR firms, and press officers, not just willy-nilly press officers, but from the British government, basically dealing with this case. The first government press officer was Cherie Dodd, a former Daily Mirror journalist who was followed by Clarence Mitchell, Director of Media Monitoring for the Central Office of Information. When the government withdrew Mitchell, the McCanns hired Justine McGuinness, who was reportedly headhunted for the job. When she left, Hanover Communications took over briefly, headed by Charles Lewington, formerly John Major's private secretary. So how many names do we have now? So there's Charles Lewington, Justine McGuinness, Clarence Mitchell, Cherie Dodd. That's 4 spokesmen already. And then there was also apparently a couple of other press officers. In September 2007, Brian Kennedy of Everest Windows stepped forward as a benefactor and offered to cover Mitchell's salary so that he could return. Mitchell resigned from his government position and started working for the McCanns full-time. He was later paid by the Madeleine's Fund. Now, if you think about it, people have donated money for the search for Madeleine, and this money is now being used in part to pay the salary of someone who's really going to just raise publicity around the McCann's narrative that somebody else committed this crime. Remember, the local police were hamstrung by the same laws, especially Detective Amaral himself, which is why his book was published the second the secrecy period expired in July 2008. Now, in terms of and by the way, that book was basically sued into silence. So anybody who did say something that wasn't what the McCanns wanted to hear, if you weren't careful, then you were silenced. And so how does the narrative that emerges emerge in the way that it emerges? In terms of the high-profile nature of the McCann case, I often hear people repeating conspiracy theories that don't seem to go anywhere. A government conspiracy, okay, but a government conspiracy in aid of what? What does make sense is that the McCanns were British tourists, and the Portuguese hotel, the resort town, and the region relied heavily on British tourism above all. And it seems like this very straightforward aspect is very seldom thought about in its own terms. And so in this respect, I want to highlight the opening paragraphs of an NBC News article, so written by an American reporter, Dennis Murphy, in March 2008, fairly early in terms of the whole Madeleine McCann saga. And I think what he says is in kind of a neutral voice, but it is nevertheless very obvious and obviously insightful, but it's something that I think many have lost track of. Anyway, in terms of his article, Murphy writes, Portugal, the coastal edge of Europe, has always been about the sea. Its great explorers sailed off into the mostly unknown centuries ago and brought back unimagined wealth to the tiny kingdom. Now, in the Madeleine McCann case, it might be a little bit strange to think about the idea of where, if you're confronted with Madeleine who's no longer alive, what would you do with her? Well, Portugal has always been about the sea, and Praia da Luz is about the sea. And isn't that where Madeleine was initially taken, from the hotel towards the sea? And one of the sightings seems to confirm this. In any event, Murphy goes on to write, but history eclipsed Portugal. The colonies and trade routes lost to greater powers. And isn't this, in a sense, this history giving perhaps the people at the center of this a sense of their preeminence over the locals? Think about this. It was up to the humble sardine to pay the bills in Portugal. But in the last 40 years, the sea has given the Portuguese its best catch since the glory days of Magellan, the British tourist. And that's a very fancy way of basically saying that the British tourist was quite valuable to the Portuguese economy, to Portuguese businesses. And of course, you've got British tourists at the center of basically a scandal, of basically a criminal investigation. Are you now going to pursue them, and in a way that might put off other British tourists? And, did you know that practically half of all overseas tourists to the Algarve are British tourists? Would you want to lose half of your golden egg, right? According to one source, 44% of all overseas guests, right? That is, the UK visitors comprise 44% of all overseas guests in the key tourism source market to the Algarve. 40% of passengers landing in Faro, and I also entered the Algarve through that same airport, are from the UK. Also, did you know that British expats comprise the second largest expat community in Portugal? And at the time, Robert Murat was one of them. So this isn't just about some doctors holidaying in the Algarve. Those doctors to the Portuguese represent something. They represent this super sardine, this kind of jackpot. And do they really want to look a gift horse in the mouth? The plot gets even thicker when one considers what was going on geopolitically in Europe in 2007. The European Union was being cobbled together, and one nation was kicking its heels about joining. And guess where the European Council signed a treaty into law in 2007? Yes, Lisbon, Portugal. And that happened in December 2007, the same year that the Madeleine McCann case took place, just a couple of months later. And guess who was absent at that treaty, but signed it separately a few hours later? Not the Dutch, not the French, not a German head of state, the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Thus, you can see if the Portuguese made a major incident out of pursuing a case against British holidaymakers, they certainly could see how the country as a whole could suffer financially in terms of prestige, and in fact they did. Even the way they handled the case, the Ocean Club did suffer financially, the Praia de Luz did suffer financially. And so imagine that, a case that's so high profile, with a particular narrative that's also so high profile that no one dares question it. It sounds at turns like you don't dare question anything regarding this particular case. And so the question then arises, did that happen by accident? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
Is it possible that Kate, with her medical background, might have wanted to help Madeleine to go to sleep that night?
There's no doubt that any new development with regard to the Madeleine McCann case would sell newspapers, 70,000 extra, 80,000